Thank you all for attending. It means so much to me and my colleagues to see this great turnout. I honestly didn't know what the reception would be, but I'm happy to announce that as of 2 p.m. today, there were over 3 events. First, I want to introduce Matt Charette for opening remarks. Matt is the director of Woods Hole Sea Grant, who graciously funded this effort through their Diversity and Inclusion program.
Thanks, Collin. Woods Hole Sea Grant is very pleased to have provided support for today's event because we are committed to building inclusive research, outreach, and education programs that serve people with unique backgrounds, circumstances, needs, perspectives, and ways of thinking. I invite you all to visit our website shown on the slide here to learn more about our work in these areas, as well as the various funding and fellowship opportunities. And then lastly, thank you, Collin, for your leadership in organizing this event. And thanks to the speakers for joining us today. Back to you.
Thanks again, Matt. We literally could not have done this without the support from you and your team at Woods Hole Sea Grant. So 9 months ago, I was driving home from work thinking about how much I miss walking across the college campus to catch a lecture on a topic that has nothing to do with my research, a topic not in the earth science and not even in the hard sciences. I used to do this at least once a quarter while in undergrad and grad school, a talk by a legal scholar, a film director, or a music historian. It didn't matter the topic, I just enjoyed the refreshing change of pace. It helps me take a step back and put things into context. To fill this void, I reached out to my buddy Stephen Roberts to send him congratulations about a paper that he wrote and was deservedly getting a lot of press. Stephen and his team conducted a series of studies with US Christians and found that when people conceptualize God as a white man, they're more likely to perceive white male job candidates as more fit for leadership than Black and female applicants. As Stephen put it, basically, if you believe that white man rules the heavens, you're more likely to believe that white men should rule Earth. I asked him if he'd be up for sharing his research with the scientific community here in Woods Hole, but before we could make this happen, COVID shut down the world. Almost 3 months later, George Floyd was murdered, and shortly thereafter, Woods Hole Sea Grant announced their Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. This was a great opportunity for Stephen and I to join forces, for the Woods Hole community and others to learn from leading researchers in the psychology field about systemic racism in America, and for me not to have to listen to another lecture about planet Earth. Before we get started, I want to give a shout out to Lisa Hunt. Lisa is an artist based out of New Jersey that helped me with the advertisement for the event that you see right now. Her work is absolutely stunning and can be found across the world in top-tier galleries. Check out her work online and maybe add something of hers to your collection at home. Our first speaker is Stephen Roberts, the leader of the Social Concepts Lab in the Psychology Department at Stanford University. Stephen received his Associates of Arts degree from Manhattan Community College, his Bachelor of Science degree in Applied Psychology from NYU, and his MS, Master of Science and PhD in Psychology from the University of Michigan. Stephen and I, and Babe, and my wife, used to play soccer at the University of Michigan together on a team called Dopamine Machine. Thinking back on these days, it made me laugh that his attendance record at the games was quite poor, but he always seemed to make it on time to the bar to root for the German national team at the World Cup. Stephen is a very accomplished scientist, a leader in his field, and I feel really, really lucky that he agreed to help me curate this symposium. Today, I'll be talking about racism in the institution of science. Take it away, Stephen.
Okay, Todd, thanks for that introduction. I do not remember my attendance record being that bad. I thought I was there. I wasn't too useful on the field, but I was there. Super thankful and honored to be here, especially with some friends and colleagues who I respect and admire who I don't get to see too often given COVID. So today I'm gonna kick us off by talking about racism in psych science and psychology as a field. And I wanted to start off with 2 disclaimers. First disclaimer is, and I think this cuts throughout all the talks, that this is in no way an indictment of any individual or any organization. These are issues that we're all embedded in. It may be easy to take things personally, but it really isn't about that. It's just a broader conversation about this inequality. And second, Collin told me that this is a group that really loves data. So I loaded up a ton of data in my talk, some new data that I'm just really excited to share that I think is relevant. I'm pretty sure I put too much information in this. I know that the more I talk now, the more I'm just wasting time. So I'm gonna get into it, but I just wanna give you that overview. Okay, so I wanna start off, you can go back one slide actually, Collin. I wanna start off by making clear that, if you ask people what is racism, if you ask 10 people, you're gonna get 10 different definitions. So I wanna kind of get us all on common ground first. I would love for you, if you can, in the chat right now, write in your definition of racism. How do you define racism? There are no right or wrong answers. Everyone has different, definitions, but I'm really curious to hear and hopefully share with the group of how the group defines racism. Sarah says racism is the water we swim in. Prejudice based on appearance, discriminating against someone, preconceived and negative notions, us versus them based on skin color, having different expectations based on appearance, hatred, prejudice plus power, discrimination against a group of people based on their race. Great, awesome, thank you for those definitions. Many different definitions. I'm gonna give you my definition. We may not all agree, but here's how I think about racism. When I think about racism, I think of a system of advantage based on race. I think of a hierarchy. It's not about what a person thinks or how a person feels or how a person behaves. It's a hierarchy, it's a caste system. Isabel Wilkerson has this great book called Caste. I highly recommend you checking out. And the question is that in a hierarchical context where some groups have more power and prestige than others, how do we think and behave in ways so we can kind of undo that hierarchy? So racism is a hierarchy, it's a system of advantage, my definition. Okay, next slide, please. Now, psychology has played a very important role in increasing racism. Louis Terman, Stanford psychologist, very problematic, used pseudoscientific data to basically advocate for segregation, advocate for sterilization laws. By virtue of Terman and some others, they legalized or mandated the sterilization of about 65,000 people in the United States. So psychologists have done a lot of damage. But psychologists can also decrease racism in the real world. Next slide, please. Great example, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. Their work on how young kids think about race and racial biases played a profound role in desegregating schools. Their data were taken to the United States Supreme Court, helped desegregate schools in the United States. So psychology can play a huge role in decreasing this stuff. Next slide, please. Now, unfortunately, psychology still has a racism problem. We've come a long way. Here's an example. This paper was published a few months ago in our leading journal. The basic argument of the paper was that countries, especially Black and brown countries with high rates of violence, are violent because of, allegedly, they have lower IQ rates, unless they are controlled by religion. This was published a few months ago and retracted for many reasons. People, got on the stats and the data and the method, but also the framing was deeply rooted in this really problematic ideology. So psychology has an important, has a racism problem. And one of the main things, the overarching theme of this particular little talk here is that if psychology has a racism problem, and we are supposedly great at understanding racial biases and where they come from and how to reduce them, if we have a racism problem, I will bet my money that you have a racism problem as well. So I want to show you some data actually on psychology's racism problem. How is it that a paper like this in 2020 gets published in our top tier journal? Next slide, please. So here is our leading journal, one of the leading journals, Psych Science. You see the journal description, which will be relevant in a minute, but below you see the editors. Now, if you Google the editors, 100% of the editors in Psych Science are white. Now, in my lab, or our argument here is that that's a problem because there aren't diverse worldviews and people of diverse perspective curating our science, and maybe that plays a role in the stuff that actually gets published. So we wanted to test that empirically. Next slide, please. Graduate student in my lab. There's a lot of information on here, so you can't see obviously can't see my mouse. Okay, so we recruited over 1,000 psych PhD students, about half were non-race scholars and half were race scholars. And we randomly assigned them to different conditions. So some of them got, you see the square on the top left, the journal description without the diversity statement. Yeah, that one. It just gives them the statement that the journal actually has on their website. And another half, they were given the one on the right, where it's the exact same statement. We just added this diversity statement at the very end, the last sentence. This journal values issues relevant to diversity in terms of both scholarship and sampling, and takes these issues into consideration during the review process. So signaling, hey, we think about this stuff. And then we also manipulated whether or not they saw that all of the editors were white, so the bottom left, whether or not there was a diverse set of editors on the right, or we left the editors unidentified. And there the idea is that, you know, who is on the editorial board, that signals something to the people interested in submitting their work. So if you, next slide, please. Okay, so we asked them many questions. One of the big questions, do you think this journal values your research? And you can see that when the editors are diverse, there's no difference between the non-race and the race scholars. So it's the panel on the far right. But when the editors are white, you see the non-race scholars, the people who don't do work on race, they think that, yeah, this journal values my research more than the race scholars. So the race scholars now think, well, this journal probably doesn't value my work. Next slide. And if you ask them, would you submit your research to this journal? Again, when the editors are diverse, they'll submit to equal degrees, but when the editors are all white, the race scholars of a variety of different racial backgrounds, they'll be less likely to submit it. So now we have an inequality in who's submitting their work to this top tier journal, a system of advantage based on race. Next slide. Now let's imagine that the race scholar does submit their stuff to the journal. You know, they go, you know what, they probably don't value it, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. We reviewed over 26,000 papers published in psychology, published between 1974 and 2018 in top tier psych journals. You can hit next. And here you'll see in cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, and social psychology, across all these publications, the vast majority of editors, those who determine whether or not something is worthy of being published were white. In cognitive psych, 100% of editors since 1974. Next slide. You'll see that here, few papers explicitly focus on race. It's about less than about 10% on average. But what's probably most important, what's not depicted here, is that when you look at the publication records of white editors in chief, you'll see about 4% of papers focus on race and racism. When the editor-in-chief is of color, that jumps to about 16%, suggesting that, hey, who's in charge of the journal has implications for what science gets published. Next slide. The few papers on race that are written are mostly written by white psychologists. So that's the panel on the left. The majority of papers on race are written by white psychologists. And on the right, you'll see that under white authors, there are mostly white participants, and under POC authors, there are mostly POC participants. Okay, so there's a kind of a pipeline thing here where most editors are white. That has implications for what gets published. The few papers on race are written by white authors, and white authors tend to recruit mostly white participants. So you see how there's a racialized pattern in our science. Next slide, please. Not only, now if you look at the content of the articles, you'll see that people talk about samples very differently. For instance, on the bottom, you'll see the percentage of white participants ranging from 0 to 100. And what you see on the y-axis is what's the likelihood of the article racializing, using a modifier to talk about the sample. So for instance, on the far right, when the sample is 100% white, you'll get an article will talk about, for instance, students' academic achievement, but the more of color the sample becomes, people start to say things like, oh, Black students' achievement, Native Americans. You racialize the sample in a way that you wouldn't with the white sample, which reinforces this idea that white people are race neutral and beyond race, right? It has consequences. Now, we also reason that one reason for this might be in the review process, that when people, you know, if I submit a paper with, let's say, 100% Black sample and advertise it as students' academic achievement, the reviewers might pressure me to say, actually, you need to qualify that and say that, you know, it's actually Black students. So we wanted to get some empirical data on that. Next, please. Next slide, please. So what we did in this study, This is led by a student of mine, Elizabeth. She recruited thousands of white and Black Americans. These are not psychologists, just in general. And for half of them, or for a third of them, they would see this. So they read about this research that has nothing to do with race. The benefits of sodalatrium for people with depression. Millions of Americans suffer from depression each year, but a promising new drug, sodalatrium, could help ease these symptoms. Blah, blah, blah. It has nothing to do with race, but what's key is you can see that we mentioned that we recruited thousands of white Americans. It's on the third sentence. So it's a finding comes from a white sample. Another group, they were told, if you could hit next, are given the exact same research, the exact same findings, but this time the sample is Black. Everything else is identical. And we asked another group, they got a version of it where we didn't mention the race of the sample. And we asked them a very simple question. Is this good science? Is this good science or bad science? Okay, next. So we recruited a group of Black and white participants. Now, if you look at, let's look at the Black participants first. If you hit next, thank you. You'll see that how they rate the version with the Black sample, the white sample is equivalent. You can hit next. And they actually value the one with the identified sample more highly. That's the best science. We can talk about why that might be the case. But what's important here is, again, who's reviewing psychology? It's mostly, white psychologists. And what you'll find is that the white participants here, when the exact same findings are with a white sample, it's better science than the exact same findings with a Black sample. You can hit next. And in fact, the white participants treated the white sample as equivalent to the unidentified sample, which is in line with that idea that whiteness is often seen as neutral. It's kind of the baseline from a white perspective. Okay, next slide. Okay, long story short, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm assuming I'm about to run out. So, those are just some data points on how race plays a very important role in psychology in terms of who submits, how do we sample the content, how we review work, what we publish. And if we want to correct this and work toward a system of equity, it's important for us to be aware of these processes, because the extent to which psychologists can reduce racism in the real world depends on the extent to which we can reduce it in our own backyard. Next. So we have this paper where we put some concrete recommendations for journals and organizations. 4, I think, are really relevant, maybe relevant to the group I'm talking to now. 1, establish a diversity task force. Get people involved to actually think about these issues. It takes a long time to collect these data and to examine them. That burden should not fall explicitly on persons of color. You need to get multiple people involved. Establish a task force. Release public diversity reports, something we're trying to pressure journals to do now. Who's involved in your organization at various levels? Are you committed to change? And can you document concrete change over time? Hold yourself accountable. 3, communicate a top-down commitment to diversity. In one of the studies, we find that, with the journals, the statements that you signal have implications for who you pull in. If you explicitly say, hey, we value this as an organization, you can pull people in. And on the same note, include diverse individuals across all levels of the organization. Now in psych, in the journal world, if the organization is 100% white, well, that signals to people who are not white or who maybe care about issues related to racial diversity that those issues are not valued at that organization. They may detach themselves from it. Next slide. Again, this is not an indictment of any individual, but if you look on the website of WHOI, I mean, there's a clear pattern. And there's a lot of research on how someone who maybe does not see themselves represented in an organization, they're given quite explicitly that maybe they're not valued or actually welcome there. And that has implications for our science and for our ideas and for our community. Next slide. And again, this is not an indictment of any individual or any organization. One thing that's come out this year is, people have recognized that science as a whole has a racism problem. It's a problem. Racism has been around before any of us have even been born. We came into the system. Well, the question is, well, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to allow it to continue, or are we going to work toward equity? So thank you so much for your time. I hope that I was kind of close to the 12-minute mark. And now I'm going to give it to pass it to a wonderful friend and inspirational person, Dr. Amber Williams, is next in the lineup. Is that correct? Great. And we'll have hopefully time for questions and discussion after. Amber Williams is one of my favorite psychologists on planet Earth. She has a PhD in developmental psychology. She's an assistant professor of psychology and child development at California Polytechnic State University. She teaches amazing classes on multicultural psychology, development in diverse cultures. She does great research on the role of race in shaping self-concepts and academic outcomes. Amber and I also went to graduate school together, and one of my favorite memories from grad school is many one-on-one meetings with Amber, just talking about race and the literature and sharpening how I think about these things. So she's educated me in many ways, and I know she'll do much to educate you all. So Professor Williams, take it away. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you, Stephen. So I also want to thank Collin for organizing this symposium around this very important topic, and thank you all for being here. Today, I'm going to discuss how we can make classrooms more inclusive and equitable spaces for underrepresented students. Next slide, please. So first, I'll talk a bit about my own experience as a racial ethnic minority in college, just to contextualize the study that I'll discuss, which focuses on instructors' fixed and growth mindsets and how these impact underrepresented student performance. I'll then provide some recommendations around how we can use this information to support underrepresented minority students in the classroom. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of my background, I went to Rice University as an undergraduate. And while that experience ended up being really wonderful in a lot of ways, when I first started, it was a really difficult transition. Like most students at Rice, I had been a high achiever in high school, and the realization that now you're just one of many was common among the students. However, I had the added burden of being African American and being aware of stereotypes about my being there, that others might perceive that I was only there because of affirmative action and that I didn't really belong, and not feeling like I could reach out to my professors if I was having issues, because I felt like, well, if I'm not doing well in this course, I just need to work harder. There's not really much a professor could do to help. I also didn't want to seem needy or be a bother. However, it came to the point that I had little choice but to talk to my chemistry professor. I was desperate to salvage my grade in the class, and to my surprise, my professor was happy I came in and helped me raise my grade significantly. He allowed me to redo homework I'd done poorly on and really made me feel like he wanted me to succeed. The next time I struggled in a class was a calculus course I was taking, and this time I went to my professor before my grade started slipping. In fact, I went to my calculus professor's office hours probably every single week. And as a professor now, I feel kind of bad about this, but she never hinted that my visits were a problem. She was really patient and she was really good at explaining complex topics. And I ended up with an A in that course, a course that I felt like I knew almost nothing about when I first started it. I believe that I'm a professor today due in no small part to these instructors who believed in me and demonstrated that in their actions, who made asking for help feel expected and normal and encouraged. The study I'll discuss next focuses on this issue of how instructors can be a major factor in supporting underrepresented minority students' success, specifically exploring how instructors' growth mindset can be beneficial for underrepresented minority students. Next slide, please. So first, I'll do a brief explanation of growth and fixed mindset. A fixed mindset says that intelligence and academic ability are just that, they're fixed. You have a certain level or a certain amount, and there's not really much you can do to get beyond that. A growth mindset says that intelligence and academic ability relate to skills that one can improve through effort, practice, and perseverance. So Canning and colleagues assessed the mindset of STEM instructors and how this related to the racial achievement gap between underrepresented minority students and Asian and white students in their classes. Instructors completed a survey assessing whether they had a fixed or a growth mindset, and this survey contained 2 statements, including, to be honest, students have a certain amount of intelligence and they really can't do much to change it. The university provided course grades for all the students in those instructors' courses, and the researchers used this data to examine associations between faculty growth versus fixed mindset and the gap between the course grades of underrepresented students compared to Asian and white students. Instructors' gender, racial ethnic background, tenure status, age, amount of teaching experience, and their field of study were also examined. Given their potential to be predictors of student achievement or moderators of the relationship between instructor mindset and the racial achievement gap in their classes. Next slide, please. So in terms of results, the researchers found that the racial achievement gap in classes in which the instructor had a fixed mindset was nearly twice as large in classes as in classes in which the instructor had a growth mindset. Notably, growth mindset raised the grades of all students, as you can see in the figure that's shown on the screen, but it was especially powerful for underrepresented minority students. Interestingly, none of those control variables I talked about at the beginning, so instructors' racial ethnic background, amount of teaching experience, etc., predicted the achievement gap, nor did they moderate the association between instructor mindset and the course achievement gap. So even if faculty were themselves underrepresented, having a fixed mindset still led to larger racial achievement gaps in their classes. Next slide, please. The researchers also found that in those courses with a professor who had a growth mindset, students were more likely to report that their instructor motivated them to do their best work, that the instructor emphasized learning and development, and that they would be likely to recommend the course with that particular instructor. These first two questions regarding motivation and the emphasis on learning and development mediated the relation between instructor mindset and their students' GPA, regardless of student racial or ethnic background. However, this effect was stronger for underrepresented minority students. Next slide, please. So why might a fixed mindset relate to students' academic performance? Well, first, it taps into pre-existing stereotypes about certain students. So which students will professors assume have the fixed ability to succeed in a STEM field? It's most likely not going to be students who are already disadvantaged and marginalized. And this includes Latinx, Native, and African American students. We are all affected by racism and stereotyping, as Stephen mentioned. And so even if we are not intending to, we may still in subtle ways send messages to students that promote this idea that they're just not smart enough to do well in the class, and there's not much they can do to change that. This discouragement may lead to lower grades among students of color through a variety of mechanisms, including activating stereotype threat. And this refers to students' lowered performance when they are reminded of a negative stereotype about their own group. They become so focused on disproving the negative stereotype that they're not good at academics or they're not good at this field. And their focus is divided from the task at hand, whether that's an exam or an assignment. And their focus is then divided and they end up confirming the stereotype they were hoping to disprove. This also likely affects how instructors structure their courses. Instructors with a fixed mindset may be less likely to provide detailed feedback on assignments or provide low stakes opportunities for students to work on their skills. If the assumption is that you either have it or you don't, then letting students figure it out on their own is going to be more likely in your classroom. And finally, instructors with a fixed mindset may also treat students who don't do well on early assignments more negatively and be less likely to spend time helping them, leading to compounding disadvantage. So you do poorly on the first grade, your professor is like, this is a lost cause, and you keep doing poorly. Next slide, please. So how can we apply this information to ensure that we're teaching students with a growth mindset and therefore supporting underrepresented minority student success? Well, first, when students struggle, remind them that the struggles they're facing are not an indictment on their belonging or their ability. Remind them that college is a transition and that adjusting and improving their grades are skills they can practice and get better at. Next, work on your own biases. When you walk into a classroom, who do you think that student's going to do well? Who do you look at and automatically think, this student is going to struggle? You may balk at the idea that you do this, say, I would never do that, but the truth is we all have these biases that are relatively automatic because we are all exposed to these stereotypes. So bringing those biases to conscious awareness actually helps us to challenge them and then change them. You can also take a growth mindset approach in how you structure your course assignments. So here's some concrete tips for helping students succeed in your course. One option is to provide students with personalized feedback early on so that they can incorporate that feedback and improve future assignments. I try to get my students their first major writing assignment back relatively quickly so that they have an idea of how to improve for their next writing assignment. It's not always possible to give super detailed feedback. I know we're all really short on time. So another option is to provide students with a summary after you've graded their assignments of what were the most common mistakes, but also include what were the greatest strengths of the assignments or the papers. Encouragement with critique helps students feel capable of improving moving forward. Another thing I do in my classes is to reach out to students who do not turn in their assignments or who do poorly on assignments. So sometimes students are going through some pretty intense situations, but they feel too ashamed or don't realize they can ask for extensions for help. When I was a student, I felt like I literally had to be on my deathbed to ask for an extension. So in any case, reaching out lets students know that you want them to succeed in your class, and it provides them with an opening to discuss, for example, concepts that they're struggling with. Providing students with low or no stakes opportunities for practice is another way to help them improve their skills. And this means providing students with, for example, weekly quizzes worth about 5 to 10% of their grade, or assigning problem sets that are only graded for completion. Finally, like me as an undergrad, your students may not feel totally comfortable approaching you when they're struggling. There are a couple of ways you can make yourself more approachable for students. First, making the purpose of office hours clear. I've had so many students, they come into my office hours and their first question is, am I bothering you? And it's become really clear that some students haven't really internalized that those office hours are for them. So making that clear for students is one step toward being more accessible. Sometimes even when students know office hours are for them, they still feel awkward stopping by. One thing that I've done a couple of times is have mandatory office hours at the beginning of the quarter. Students are required to come into office hours before week 3 or so, just to introduce themselves, ask any clarifying questions. And this works really well if you have smaller classes, but even if you have a larger class, you can have students come into your office hours in groups. This allows students to familiarize themselves with you, where your office is, maybe even get to know some students in the class, and it may make them feel more comfortable coming to you if they ever feel the need to visit in the future. Next slide, please. So I hope this was informative and helpful, and I really look forward to the Q&A. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Amber. A lot of those tips are super helpful for mentoring students in the lab as well. Okay, so our next speaker is Mike Rizzo. He is a postdoctoral fellow at NYU. Mike received his Bachelor of Science in Psychology from UC San Diego and a PhD in Human Development and Quantitative Methodology from the University of Maryland. He's the only person on this panel that didn't spend some time in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan, and we don't hold that against him. His research focuses on the social and moral development of children, and today he's going to speak about how racial biases emerge in early childhood and what white parents, like me, should do to preempt them.
Awesome. Thanks, Collin, for the introduction. I will say I never attended Michigan, but as someone who grew up just outside of Chicago and had most of my family and friends attend there, I am still a big fan of the blue. So I also just want to say thanks to you and to Matt and to Stephen for setting this whole thing up and for inviting me, and of course to Amber and Babe for sharing your research as well. I'm really excited to engage in this conversation with you all. All right, so for my talk, I'm going to focus on how racial biases emerge in early childhood and what white parents in particular can do to preempt that development. Next. There we go. So I want to start off by dispelling two common myths about how children come to think about race. The first being the idea that infants are somehow born racist, and the second is the idea that children are somehow colorblind and just can't see race at all. Aside from the fact that these are both obviously contradictory, they both share two key problems. The first is that both of these myths conflate seeing race with being racist or holding racial biases. There's nothing wrong with having a racial identity, and there's nothing inherently racist about acknowledging someone else's racial identity. What matters is how we conceptualize race and when we start to make problematic inferences about individuals based on their racial group memberships. The second issue with both of these myths is that they assume that children simply are one way or the other. They're either born racist or they're completely oblivious to race altogether. This is the wrong way to think about it. Racism is an active process. It's something that you do. And the formation of racial biases, stereotypes, and prejudice is an active developmental process. It's something that emerges over time. Next. So let's dig into what this process looks like a little bit. I'm obviously going to gloss over a lot of the nuances and detail here, but the general developmental story is that within the first year of life, infants are able to see race. It means they're capable of making some of the basic racial categorizations based on the racial groups that are salient within their environment. With age, then, children begin to form their own sense of racial identity and how they fit into the categories that they're seeing in the world. It's at this point where children start to form the racial biases, preferences, and stereotypes that serve as the roots for the later development of racial prejudice and more active racial discrimination. Next. So with the roadmap laid out, I think we have a couple of important questions to ask ourselves. The first is how? How do categories turn into biases, and how do biases turn into prejudices? And then second, what can we do about this? How can we work to disrupt this developmental process? Next. And so it turns out that the answer to this question is both simultaneously really complex, but it's also incredibly simple. Children learn racial biases in pretty much the same way that they learn about anything else. They observe what's happening in the world around them, and then they interpret it in a way that makes sense to them. So if we want to understand how children form racial biases, we can just take a look at some of the things that they're observing in the world, and then next. So the first thing that children are seeing is racial segregation. And yes, I get it. Children are also seeing racial integration. And yes, the United States is becoming increasingly more racially diverse by the day. But by and large, racial segregation is still the norm in our country. From the neighborhoods that children grow up in, to the classes that students take in school, and even the friends that they're sitting with at their lunch tables. Racial segregation is very much the norm. As just a quick example of a macro level of this, the maps on the right here are called racial dot maps. I can post the link in the chat if you're interested. And basically what it is for each dot that you can kind of see on that map, that's one person who filled out the US Census, and the color of the dot corresponds to their racial identity. So as you can see, there is a fair degree of racial diversity in both New York and Boston, our two respective cities. The neighborhoods within these cities are almost entirely segregated by race. You can see clear clusters of different colors on this map representing the racial segregation that's occurring. Next. This isn't just a problem for cities either. For those of you who are curious, here's the map of Woods Hole. So again, for those of you who are raising your children here, I think it's important to consider what are the observations that your children are going to make about the world based on this environment. I again want to be clear that it's not a judgment. I'm not trying to judge you. I'm not telling you to move or to feel bad about where you live or the lack of diversity in your neighborhood. I grew up in a place that looks a hell of a lot like this. I'm just asking you to be aware of it and to acknowledge the fact that your children are also aware of it too. All right, next. All right, so I hope that wasn't too personal for anyone. I do want to move now into another thing that children are observing in the world, and that's racial hierarchy. Next. So I'm sure, as many of you are aware, there are massive racial disparities in our country in terms of economic outcomes, educational opportunities, access to healthcare, treatment within the criminal justice system, and many, many other areas. I think what a lot of white parents specifically don't know and find surprising is that their children are also aware of these disparities too. So when we and other labs across the country show children pictures of houses that look like these and pictures of kids that look like these, the vast majority, 70% of children as young as 4 to 5 years old, say that the white girl must live in the wealthier house and the black girl must live in the lower income house. And we see the same thing when we flip the pictures of houses with pictures of cars that families drive. Oh, sorry. go back, there we go. The cars that families are driving, the vacations that families are taking, the clothes that kids are wearing. The story here is really clear. Children are aware of the racial disparities in the environments that they're growing up in. Okay, next. Okay, so children aren't just becoming aware of these through observing them actively or kind of in person in the world. They're also observing clear messages about racial segregation and racial hierarchy in the TV shows and the media that they watch. I had to take out like 10 minutes worth of slides detailing all of the different ways that children's media perpetuates ideas of racial segregation and hierarchy for the sake of time, but I do want to leave you with one specific image. Next. So this is literally the opening scene, the first 30 seconds of the first episode of the first season of a show called Sophia the First that millions of children growing up this country started watching earlier this decade. In case you can't see what's going on in this scene, it's depicting 3 little white princesses and princes riding in their chariot as their white father, who of course is the king of the land, tells their black driver where to go. It's examples of racial segregation and it's an example of racial hierarchy. If you have more questions about children's media, I'm totally happy to talk about it in the discussion, but I am going to just move forward from there for the sake of time. All right, so I also want to be clear that it's not just what children are observing in the world that matters. In fact, children's ability to observe and detect these patterns in their environment is critical to their ability to do something about them. If we ignore racial segregation and racial hierarchy, how can we possibly take responsibility for it and do something to change it? So what really matters here is how children come to interpret the racial segregation and hierarchy that they're seeing in the world. Are they viewing them as injustices that need to be addressed, or are they viewing them as reflective of a fair and just society? So next. In our research, we asked children exactly these questions. We asked them who they think their friends would want to play with and who they think their parents would want them to play with. Across a few different studies now, we find that the vast majority of white children in particular expect that their friends want to play with primarily white kids and that their parents want them to play with primarily white kids as well. What's happening here is that children are interpreting the racial segregation that they see in the world to be intentional and prescriptive. They're interpreting it to be the way the world is supposed to be. And that's and what's probably not surprising to you is that the children who go on to form these beliefs, the idea that interracial friendships are not valued or are uncommon, these are the kids who go on, when we assess them longitudinally, to develop higher levels of racial biases over time. All right, next, thank you. So what about racial hierarchy? After we show children the pictures of the houses and the kids that I showed you just a second ago, we asked them a really important question here, and that's why. Why do you think each of those kids lives in those houses? Now, children's responses here are admittedly a little bit more mixed. Some kids don't really know, some kids just kind of guess, but some kids, a small majority in fact, around 55 to 60%, endorse the idea that there are just different kinds of kids in the world and that some kids just live in nicer houses than others because of who they are. It's just part of who they are as people. So I want to note here just really quickly that very few kids seem to endorse this idea when we present them with a counter-stereotypic example of a wealthy black child and a poor white child. This belief really only seems to show up when we're showing them wealthy white kids and poor black children. Okay, again, it's probably not a huge surprise to any of you based off of these ideas that it's the children who endorse this idea that racial inequalities exist because of inherent differences between groups of people. These are the kids who go on to develop higher levels of racial biases over time as well. So as a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, whatever, whenever we're going when we're going over the activities that you can do with the children in your lives, you should be thinking about specifically, how can I stop these two beliefs from forming? How can I stop my child from viewing interracial friendships as unvalued by the people in their world? And how can I stop children from thinking that racial inequalities exist because of fundamental differences between racial groups? Okay, next. Awesome. All right, so the learning part of the talk is done now. Let's get into some action. What specifically can you do to help the children in your lives develop a healthy understanding of race? And the first thing is actually really simple. You need to educate yourself. Attending this seminar is by no means the end of your road here. Racial education is an ongoing process, and you should be really mindful of your own understanding of race and racism before you even think about talking to your child about it. I've listed a few books here: How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Tatum, and White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. But there are many, many more that you can dig into and find on your own. There's also a number of free online programs that are designed specifically to walk white adults through a healthy understanding of race. Justice in June is a really great example of that, it's specifically designed to provide this sort of educational experience for white adults who just don't know what's going on here. Okay, and then finally, I wouldn't be much of an academic if I didn't advertise my own work. So here I'm going to tell you about one of the recent papers that Stephen Roberts and I, hi Stephen, published recently this summer in American Psychologists, where we review the 7 psychological factors that contribute to American racism in particular. All of these links I can put in the chat if you're interested. Otherwise, they're right there on screen. Okay, next. All right, so skipping forward to a point where you might now have a better understanding of race and racism, the next step is to talk to your child about it. I know that these conversations, especially for white folks, don't feel natural or normal, they feel awkward, and it's really hard to think about how this might play out, but it's really, really important. Study after study now is coming out showing that children whose parents don't talk to them about race and racism end up developing more racial biases than kids whose parents do. So in having these conversations, again, I want you to go back and think about these 2 key beliefs. Is my child viewing interracial friendships as uncommon or not valued? And is my child viewing racial inequalities as due to internal differences between racial groups? And what can I do to stop that? It's really hard for me to provide any sort of concrete example or modal example. You're going to have to tailor this to your own child's understanding, their age, and their current understanding of race and racism. All right, so how do you start these conversations? There's a number of different ways that you can do this. The first is, I think, thinking about it rather than having a one-time conversation, thinking of it as an ongoing conversation that you do, right? You're embedding these messages into the conversations that you're already having with your kids, asking them about their friends and the kids in their schools, and just finding general ways of communicating how much you value racial diversity and inclusion in your own social networks, and also how much you value it in their networks as well. There are also a ton of amazing museums, especially in the Boston area, that are focused on racial and cultural education. I encourage you to attend those and other public events. I do want to emphasize the public here. Please don't just show up into spaces that you're not invited to. That should go without saying, but it seems not to in many cases. So I want to put that there. And then finally, you can sit down and actually watch children's TV shows and read books with your children. Now, I know I literally just told you that much of children's TV is garbage, and it is, but there are a number of notable exceptions to that rule that I've posted here. And what you can do is you can sit down and actually read these books with your child, watch these shows with your child, and talk to them about what's going on in the stories and how it differs from what they're used to seeing and reading. And look, if you want to watch the garbage TV, you can do that too. Go ahead, we all watch garbage TV, but use it as an opportunity to help your child identify the problematic aspects of these TV shows and books, and talk about what specifically could be changed in these shows to make them better for everyone. Okay, next. All right, and the last activity for you all is to get engaged. Go out and bring your child with you when you're engaging in these civic activities aimed at making our country a more equitable and just society. It's fun for them, and it's a great way to get them involved with civic engagement from an early age. If you're also looking for more hands-on, kind of one-on-one experience with anti-racist parenting activities and practices, there are also a ton of really great NGOs that are designed specifically for this right around the corner from you. So Embrace Race and Embrace Race and Story Starters are both based in Boston, and they have online programs as well. And We Stories is another organization that's based in St. Louis, but has a really large online community there. So each of these groups have an incredibly successful program. I know I run some of the effectiveness testing for these programs. And what we're seeing is that these programs are working. They're helping to reduce their children's racial biases over a several-month period. Right, so getting engaged and staying engaged with those communities is a great idea. And then finally, if you're interested in helping us to better understand how children develop racial biases and to test new intervention methods for reducing that process, you can participate in our online research with kids by creating an account at discoveriesinaction.org, Once you create this account, you'll be able to see a list of available studies that your child is eligible for. They all take about like 10 minutes. Kids answer fun questions, and then afterwards we send you a $10 Amazon gift card as a thank you for contributing to science. It's super quick, it's super easy, the kids love it, it's a lot of fun, and it's definitely something to do while you're stuck inside over the holidays in quarantine. Next. And so with that, I want to thank everyone for listening, and I'll leave you with this amazing quote from Grace Lee Boggs on taking responsibility for the change that we want to see in our society.
Stephen, are you going to introduce Babe now?
Okay, thank you, Mike, and Michael and Amber. Next, our next speaker, Dr. Babe Kawaii-Bogue, who has a PhD in psychology and in social work, an anti-racism consultant currently located in the Bay Area, another Michigan Wolverine. Babe has done really amazing work on racism and micro and macro aggressions in both interpersonal and organizational contexts. She recently developed this really powerful anti-racism guide specifically for organizations that has informed many, many institutions, including my own Stanford that we use in our diversity committee to restructure our organization. She's profoundly, really thoughtful. She's bold and super knowledgeable. And it's a really great honor to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Babe Kawaii-Bogue.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. Good afternoon, everyone. I will be presenting on strategies to combat anti-Blackness and white supremacy in institutions. And you will also be receiving a detailed guide that Dr. Roberts mentioned that I wrote expanding on these strategies for you to use in your departments and organizations. So just to start, I would like you to close your eyes for a moment and think about how you arrived at your current institution. If that's Woods Hole or another institution, I want you to think about how you first heard about the institution and who helped you get there. Who were your recommenders, your connections to the institution? Were your connections to your institution white or people of color? And how many Black people had those same connections? If you would like to share the answers in the chat, please do so. Next slide, please. So proximity to whiteness gives access and opportunities for education and career advancement. And it has evolved into modern day institutions with these statistics. So this data was just shared with me last week. Woods Hole is approximately 88% white and 62% male, with Black employees not even making up 1% of the institution today. The board of directors is quote unquote overwhelmingly white and male, and the chairman of the board and corporation are all white men. Next slide, please. Here are some other statistics specifically about the faculty at Woods Hole, those who have more of the clout in the institution. And just to note, there are no demographic data listed for Black faculty. White faculty occupy over 80% of faculty positions, and male faculty comprise over 70% of faculty positions. And of the senior scientists, 86% are white and 78% are male. Black faculty, again, are not even part of this data table. Next slide, please. So these data are the result of generations of anti-Blackness in policies and practices in education, housing, and the workforce. And they continue to create harm for people of color, in particular Black employees who are often isolated in their careers in research and academia. I found this incredibly detailed diversity report for Woods Hole online. This report is very strong, and I commend those who spoke up and participated in this report because it is a great example of a start to unearthing and dismantling institutional racism. For those at Woods Hole who have not read it, or even others who intend to do diversity work in other institutions, I recommend reading this diversity report online and ensuring that your institution has something like this documented. I read the entire report and will be sharing a few strategies to combat anti-Blackness and white supremacy in institutions that were not discussed as a part of this report, but that are so crucial to dismantling institutional racism. Next slide, please. I would like to now just share with everyone the guide I wrote that you can obtain actually right now by emailing anti-racist-action-guide@gmail.com. And the guide will be sent to you automatically. I wrote this guide because I recognize the need for direction when thinking about specific strategies for dismantling anti-Black racism and how little direction we have as a country on how to do that effectively. And to clarify for folks who aren't used to hearing the word dismantle, I use it because it centers the importance of systems change in anti-racism work. And this guide was written for the mental health field specifically, but part 1 of the guide was written with all institutions in mind, and part 3 of the guide is for any individual looking to further their racial consciousness. Next slide, please. So to combat anti-Blackness and white supremacy in institutions, we must first create time for organized systems change. Time scarcity is based on a white dominant cultural narrative that controls how we operate within institutions. Time has been stolen from Black people and other people of color, and thus to remedy this injustice, institutions can offer time to dedicate to change. And this is really up to those in positions of power. But it's important to note that change will not occur if it is optional or volunteer. It must be prioritized and a requirement on company time. If joining a diversity committee is optional, volunteer, or not an integrated part of staff meetings, this can prevent collective action and systemic change from taking place. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The Woods Hole Diversity Report that was shown a couple slides ago had several recommendations for retention efforts, though it was missing like a very clear question that I think many retention efforts miss because it is so simple and straightforward. It's important for supervisors to ask the following question at least once a year to every underrepresented employee. What are 1 or 2 things we can do to retain you as an employee? It sounds really simple, but I can tell you that I have never been asked this question, at least not until I wrote this guide this summer. It is important to take the response you receive as a supervisor or director from an underrepresented employee very seriously and act on it immediately. So I took the liberty of typing in retention strategies into Google and found endless pages and sites offering general strategies for retaining employees. But one thing that stood out to me was the retention strategy recommending employers offer a comfortable work environment for their employees. So what is considered comfortable is different for every employee and definitely different between cultures, ages, and genders. What's comfortable for an older white male employee might not be comfortable for a younger Black woman employee. So this is why this tailored question is crucial for retention. You have no idea what will retain an employee without asking them. Next slide, please. So another strategy is creating a consultation and healing space for Black employees. So does your department or institution have a consultation or healing space for Black employees? And if not, you can develop one so that Black employees can meet where they can be free from the white gaze. And I use the word white gaze because historically African Americans were not able to congregate outside of white overseeing for fear of collective action. Churches were actually the only place African Americans were allowed to congregate in large groups. This is likely the reason why churches have a strong tie to the Black community still today. This ability to congregate is rare and especially in predominantly white institutions, but it is a very important offering for Black employees to have a space to collectively process their unique experiences in the workplace. It's important that this space be designed by Black employees and optional to attend and a part of the paid workday. Next slide, please. So Black lives have long been exploited to build colonial capital on US soil and globally. Black women, for instance, still make only 66 cents to the dollar that a white man makes. And it's important to note that Black liberation cannot exist unless there is a conscious effort to dismantle capitalism. While we all work or operate within a capitalist system in some form, we can still challenge productivity goals and expectations. This is one of the most powerful ways to combat anti-Black racism in the workplace. Institutions can challenge productivity-driven systems by offering space and time for Black employees to breathe. So this means for directors and supervisors to resist the urge to needlessly intensify the pace of work, and instead think about incorporating 30-minute blocks of time during the workday for breathing and attending to human needs. And lastly, examine the following questions with staff if you're doing diversity work in your institution. Who controls time in your institution? How does time operate in your institution? And how is time used to oppress and to liberate Black employees? Next slide, please. So finally, institutional leaders and employees need to identify, challenge, and dismantle white dominant culture in their departments and institutions, irrespective of whether white people are working in a particular department. White dominant culture can be practiced and upheld by any racial group, but white people are the greatest beneficiaries of these cultural practices on a systems level. Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized people of color are the most adversely impacted by white dominant cultural practices. So it's important to consider the following questions. What are the origins of your departmental norms, practices, and policies? To what extent is your institution's culture rooted in white dominant culture? How does this culture affect Black employees and racial equity more broadly? In the Anti-Racist Action Guide, under Part 1 and Strategy 8, you'll find a link to a document titled White Dominant Culture and Something Different. Use this worksheet as a part of your collaborative anti-racism work in your institution. Next slide, please. So if you intend to do any anti-racism work in your institution, please review Part 1 of the guide. It will provide various strategies and a lot more in-depth information than I provided you in these like 10 to 12 minutes today to combat anti-Blackness and white supremacy in your departments. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, babe. That was great. And thanks to everyone, right? Mike, Amber, and Stephen for these great talks. We're going to transition now to the panel. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm pretty sure that folks have been entering questions in the Q&A. If you haven't already and you have questions, please enter them. We have quite a few that have compiled up. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but honestly, there's a lot of questions out there. So the first question is pretty broad, and it's not to anyone in specifically, but just how would you respond to a friend or a family member or a colleague who says, you know, I want to help out with diversity and inclusion efforts and anti-racist efforts, but I don't know where to start, and I'm too afraid to say the wrong thing. Does anybody want to take a stab at this one?
I want to be very mindful of my voice, and I'm going to step back, but I want to answer that question and also connect it to something that I just realized and felt, especially listening to Babe talk. You know, so the question is, you know, how does one engage in this work? And there's a fear of wanting to mess up. I want to also, you know, make clear that, you know, especially for people who are often the oppressed by systems and who find themselves disadvantaged by it, it's really hard to talk about this stuff, and it can be very draining. It's very close to home, but you know, I think for certain people in certain positions, you don't really have the choice to speak up and comment on it because it affects your life on a daily basis. So one response I would have, you know, to anyone who's questioning, hey, I want to get involved, but I don't want to do anything wrong, which is completely legit and fair, and I would lead in and center open with that. I want to learn, you know, I can make mistakes. But I would also encourage you to be mindful that some people have no choice but to be involved. They are constantly involved, and it's a very draining, tiring existence. So to acknowledge the fact that you're even asking the question, should I get involved or not, says a bit about your position to the problem at hand. And I think that awareness is very important, and something that I was just very mindful of as Babe was talking, because it's hard to hear and talk about this stuff because it's so close to home. So acknowledge, and if you have an option, that's a privilege in and of itself.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just talk a little bit about that. I totally agree with Stephen that it's so important that white people get involved in this work because it disproportionately falls on people of color. And then we have this cultural tax in terms of being on every diversity committee and, you know, just being spread thin. Anytime anybody wants to think about diversity, you know, it's always people of color. And so the more you educate yourself, the more that you can take that burden, and also some of the blowback that people of color get when they have these discussions. One, you know, place to start is, like Mike said, educating yourself, and which is a lifelong journey. I think it's a both and thing where you want to get involved, but you also, you know, aren't going to jump in and solve racism in a month. And I think a lot of people want really immediate results when they start to get involved, but this is a lifelong journey. And so it's really important to educate yourself. Something I tell people that always surprises them is that, you know, if you have a Twitter, start following people from underrepresented groups. I've learned so much from following people who are from various underrepresented minority statuses, people who are disabled, part of the LGBTQ community, people who are Native American, and just giving me more different perspectives than I would have in my day-to-day life. And the other thing is thinking about, you know, what if I do something wrong or say something wrong? You know, we all make mistakes, and I think that's okay. But it's also important that if someone says, hey, you did something wrong, you know, that term you use is incorrect, important to step back and not have a defensive posture. I think our automatic feeling is, well, I didn't mean it, and you're calling me a racist and all of this stuff. And Robin DiAngelo talks about this in her book, White Fragility. And it's really important to step back from that reaction and just say, thank you. And I will, you know, think about this, educate myself more, but thank you for, because it takes a lot of risk on the other side to say, that's something that you did that was wrong, because we know that there's a lot of blowback from that. So taking that as a gift to you instead of trying to humiliate you or something like that is really important.
Yeah, I can also add, I think, you know, when you said, Collin, that somebody is afraid of saying the wrong thing, that just makes me think like about this correlation that I noticed between how comfortable people with racial privilege are and how little movement there is for racial justice. So for white supremacy to be dismantled, those with racial privileges need to be uncomfortable in the anti-racism work they are doing. So it's not dismantling something you benefit from if you're comfortable doing it. So to expect that discomfort to come and to be okay with it, and to say to yourself, I'm gonna mess up, I'm going to be a liability, and to even communicate that to others because they already know it.
Just jump in and echo what everyone else has said. I agree wholeheartedly. I think just focusing on, for me, especially as a white person, and thinking about how do I navigate these spaces, I try to think about where am I positioning myself in these spaces, and what am I doing, right? What do I know, and how can I help others, right? So trying to focus on my own education, and then also when I'm going out and trying to do these active, more active processes, where am I in this? Am I leading this? Am I the voice? Am I the face of this? Or am I sitting back, stepping into a more supportive role, and just trying to help support other folks who are doing the work? And so that's how, at least I try to think of it.
I guess I'll follow up with this concept of the burden, you know, always being placed, or often being placed, on those who are represented. And a question came in from someone who says, you know, as someone who has definitely been the minority in the workplace, I really appreciate this talk, but my question is, how do you keep going despite the exhaustion that comes with being the minority in the workplace?
I can talk about that. It is, I mean, so Cal Poly is like the only CSU that is majority white. I live in a majority white space, and it is hard not to see people who look like you, who come from your same cultural background, who you feel like you can just be around without having to code switch or, be on in that way. What I found is finding community, a lot of the work that I do gives me energy in terms of supporting underrepresented students, for example, having those students in my lab and seeing them flourish and seeing them, move forward and seeing myself in them. Like, this is the work that I wanted to be doing when I was an undergrad. I thought these instructors have helped me. I want to help my students. And so that gives me a lot of energy. And then just, finding my community, finding my people who I can vent to after an event. And I'm like, can you believe this person said this? Also finding really good allies. I've been really lucky to where, if something happens, I'm a junior faculty. So if something happens and I'm like really uncomfortable with it, I can kind of recruit some more advanced faculty who will be like, okay, I'm going to bring that up. And so I think having allies, but also having your own community where you can just, before COVID, we would have these parties where it was like faculty of color and we would get together and have a potluck and do, games and things like that. And so finding your community, I think, is really important.
Babe, you wanna say something? I can say something really quickly, or you want to go?
You can go ahead.
I'll be quick. For me, I think that I've gotten to the point where I'm just used to being tired. I'm just like, this is just my life. I'm just going to be tired all the time for the foreseeable future, because it is super draining. But what keeps me moving, despite the constant fatigue, and this year has been especially draining on multiple levels in a way that I never really thought was possible. Like, just spiritually tired of. It's just been an intense year. But for me, I'm really passionate about this work. Racism has affected me very deeply, has affected my family very deeply. So my motivation is, um, you know, trying to bring about some kind of equality and equity, and that just inspires me very much, and it keeps me moving, despite my fatigue. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to be tired all the time. I mean, I've had health issues this year because of my fatigue, so you definitely got to take care of yourself. But the message that I'm sending now is, for me, and maybe it's not necessarily a good thing, but I'm just used to being tired, and I've gotten to a point where I'm okay with that. I value equality over alertness at this point. I'd rather have equality. Anyway, yes, that's my thing.
And I'll just add, I mean, it may be actually optional to stay where you are. I chose to leave academia because I knew that I would not be represented. And like Dr. Roberts said, I'm very blunt and open, and it's not something that academics like. So, I think you don't need to stay. If you feel like you're stuck, I guess that's different, but I think people have more options than they realize.
And if I could also add one thing, on the notion of fatigue and being blunt, many of the ideas that Babe presented, I agree with 100%. But I maybe wouldn't talk about it that way in my institution, because I know if I talk about it a certain way, I'm going to get a certain reaction. But it's also tiring and draining to find a way to communicate in order to get your message across and be effective. That ends up being so taxing and tiring, versus, can I just freely say that, hey, this institution is really deeply invested in white supremacy, or the belief that white people are superior. You can't say that in certain spaces, and that's tiring, of learning how to navigate this world in a way where you can even have the conversation.
And I think it's something that Stephen brought up in his talk was that psych science paper. I think that is also exhausting, that I think, it was like the pandemic was happening, and then all of these, the protests were happening. And then also like science was just like revealing itself all over the place. I mean, there were multiple papers that came out that were like, Black people are just not that intelligent when you really boil it down. And it's it's isolating to feel like the field that you've devoted your life to still has so many people who are really, really invested in white supremacy. And so, you know, I think this is again why we do need white people to, as Babe mentioned, get uncomfortable and get involved in this work. Because, you know, what Stephen mentioned, I think is really somewhat upsetting to me because, you know, we know that activists who do this work, they often end up with chronic disease and dying early because they've dedicated their lives to this work. And research shows that racism, when you're kind of like experiencing it and fighting it, that kind of thing has direct impact on health. Like Dr. I forget his first name, but Williams at Harvard University talks about how the little things being followed in a store, at the level of looking at your arteries, we can see the effects of racism on heart disease. And so again, steeping yourself in this work probably has even more consequences for that. And so, I mean, I don't know that there is a solution besides, you know, yeah, white people getting involved in this work and confronting their own biases and the biases of their departments and areas.
So I'm going to switch gears. Those are just amazing responses. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to think a little bit about institutional racism, or racism in institutions. And there's a big, you know, calling right now in the Q&A about, in the chat windows about how the support needs to come from the top down. You know, the leaders need to support this coming from top down to make change. And with that comes money. You know, we need money to infect some of this change as well. And one question here is about, is there any advice for convincing institutions to dedicate monetary resources for these changes? And I'm wondering, Babe, if you have anything in your manual about this, is how do you convince folks that are at the top that they need to devote resources to affect change?
Yeah, this is this is a hard question. I'm all about you can't make people do things they don't want to do, just as a therapist. So I think, you know, it is really up to the individuals to care and to want to make change. I think there are a lot of people that do in positions of power, but I don't think they know how most effectively. And I think that's where the guide comes in to work with them. But the guide is not for people that don't want to make change. That's a very difficult question. I don't know if others have thoughts.
I have an anecdote story I could share. So this past year, the Stanford Psychology Building was named after David Starr Jordan, who worked with Terman, who was a Harper eugenicist, who led the US eugenics movement. It's very problematic. You come to Stanford, come down beautiful Palm Drive, first thing you see is Jordan Hall. That name is right there. Long story short, this year we started to work toward changing the name. We brought it to the president's office. The students supported it. We all wanted to change it. It's in the president's office. The president needs to make a decision. We had to, by virtue of a policy, have a town hall where we had all the Stanford leadership and students there. And we just had a conversation about, okay, should we change this? And I was actually surprised that, well, not too surprised, but kind of surprised that a lot of the alumni, mostly white, all white alumni, and some very powerful people who shall remain nameless, were like, hey, we're not changing it. You're erasing history. We'll put up a plaque to say, hey, David Starr Jordan did some problematic things, but we're not changing the name. And then at one point, one of the students got up, who's a student of color, who said, who basically just gave his experience. He said, you know, when I walk into that building under Jordan Hall, who I know did not want me here, and who sterilized thousands of people who looked like me and would be rolling over in his grave if I was here, it affects me at a very deep level where I do not feel like this university, that this place respects me, that it wants me here. I have that on top of my mind. I do not want to be here. And anyway, at that point, when he started sharing his experience, one of the people, the alumni, who used to be the president of a major university that shall remain nameless, got back on and said, you know what? I changed my mind. I absolutely think that we should change the name. And it just turned the whole tide of the conversation. And then kind of everyone got on board and it's like, yeah, we got to change it. So moral of the story for me was sometimes if you want to get leadership, people in powerful positions to make changes, you need to appeal to their emotions and to their hearts and kind of give them, help them perspective share. Mike's work shows that, you know, people in high status positions often have a hard time seeing from other people's perspectives and empathizing. But if you get them to see, like feel what it's like to be in that position, I think that can be one effective strategy. Not the only, but one.
I also wanted to add to that community organizing. I know I mentioned before unions are something that people are getting involved in because of diversity issues and mandates, right? In the guide, I do have a section on how to get involved in policy work, especially for women and people of color, because there are mandates you can place on institutions through policies and organizing.
So I'll change the tone to be a little bit more specific now with the questions. There's a lot of interest in examples of racial segregation and hierarchy in children's television programming, Mike. Folks would like to hear more about different examples you have. You mentioned that you took a lot of content out and it sounds like they want to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I can just talk about it really quickly. It sounds like a lot of, at least in the chat, there's also conversations about institutions in Woods Hole as well. So I don't want to distract from that conversation. But the gist of the story here is that it comes down to the quality and the quantity of representation, right? How many people are being portrayed, or how many people of color are being portrayed on screen, and then what roles are they filling? So if you want to look at the number of words spoken by white characters in children's TV shows, it's off the charts. If you want to look at who those white characters are talking to, it's predominantly white characters, right? The characters of color that are occupying the spaces in these shows are put into background roles. They're there to support the white character, which again, it sends a clear message of both racial segregation in terms of who are the ones who are actually doing the thing that's going on in the TV show, whatever it is, but it also sends messages about hierarchy, about who should be doing the things that are going on. It's a number of different things that play out, and kids are just picking up on all of it. Yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. I'm also happy to chat more offline, but I don't want to distract from the specific conversation of Woods Hole.
Looks like there's a big discussion about Agassiz Road in Woods Hole, but none of you all know the current status of the renaming of that road, so we'll move on.
And if it helps, when we renamed Jordan Hall, we took a statue of Agassiz, who was on the front of the Psych building. That was taken down about 2 weeks ago. So that's, I mean, Agassiz, I mean, he had that was a very intense person. I mean, you pull up a quote of Agassiz and you're like, is this the person we want to celebrate? It's pretty intense.
Okay, Amber, there's one question here that really resonates with me because I don't really do much teaching, but this person wants to know about how applying this growth and fixed mindset to the laboratory, you know, when you're mentoring students in the lab, but also this concept of helping mentoring your students and choosing the right journals and how to network at conferences, that type of stuff. Do you want to speak maybe a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, so taking a growth mindset in a lab can look a lot of different ways that are very similar to how we teach. So I remember I went to grad school straight out of undergrad. And so I remember I took my stat class, and I really love statistics. I still do, but all the statistics that I'd done in college had been by hand. Like we did everything by hand. And so then when I was so embarrassed. I went to my the TA for the class, and I was like, I literally don't know anything about SPSS. She was like, what's a case? I was like, no, I don't know. And so, but she was, again, just so incredibly patient and like really bright, and she would at the end of the class do muddy points, and then she'd have us like do these problem sets, and just, and again, ended up getting an A+ in both my stat classes. And I again think that, you know, that could have gone a very different way if she'd been like, what do you mean you don't know this? Like, read a book or something. And so I think one of the first things is just to recognize that not all of your students have the same experiences. Some of them will have been research assistants for a while and kind of know how things go, know who's in the field. And some of them won't know that. And that doesn't necessarily mean, oh, this person is not fit for this program. Connecting them with other graduate students. You know, one of the things that was really helpful for me was my first year, we were kind of required to be in our lab for a certain number of hours. And that was really great for me because I ended up getting mentored by older graduate students who kind of showed me the ropes of like how to do things. What, you know, I marvel at what I didn't know when I first got to grad school. And so I think being a supportive mentor, making sure you create community for your students, you know, don't just leave them out to dry. Just like, okay, you know, go do this, you know, analysis, and then, you know, come back to me. You know, not having that kind of super transactional relationship, but actually being a mentor and connecting your students to, oh, you're having trouble writing, why don't you talk to this person? You know, another thing that we did was when someone would get an NSF, they would, you know, it was expected that, okay, you're passing that NSF example down to the next generation of students. Those kinds of like connections that students have to other people who have been successful in those ways, helping students to build, and not just expecting them to do it by themselves, but helping them to build their connections to other people. So if you go to a conference, like I remember going to conferences and being like, I'm expected to just go up to these people, but thankfully my advisor was like, oh, Amber, come meet this person. They work on this, this, and this. So taking a really proactive and not just, you know, I'm your advisor, I kind of make sure you're making progress, but stepping into that mentor position and being accessible to students, I think, is taking a growth mindset and saying, you can get better at this by practice, by perseverance. You know, you deserve to be here.
That was incredibly helpful. So thank you. We only have 2 minutes left. I think we should just wrap up. I just want to extend so much gratitude for you all for taking your time and participating in this. It's been incredibly helpful, and there's just a overall enthusiasm, positive response from this event. There was over 200 people logged in at one point. I wasn't keeping track, but it's just amazing to see the turnout. I do want to mention to everyone who is in attendance that there's an exit survey that we're going to be emailing to you all on Monday morning and probably following up every week. The whole goal of the exit survey is to collect basic data on diversity and inclusion efforts and perspectives in the community, as well as evaluate the usefulness of events like this. Ideally, this event becomes a reoccurring thing where we expand to different topics under the big umbrella of diversity and inclusion. I'd also like to just thank everyone behind the scenes for helping out. So Mike Mazzota, Matt Barton, Kaylee Griffin. Big thanks to Woods Hole Sea Grant for sponsoring the event, and to Lisa Hunt for designing the graphic. So thank you all so much. Again, this went extremely well. I'm just thrilled with the response we're getting. And thank you so much for all the hard work you're doing with your research. Bye, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone again. Fantastic.